Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Trigger warning for a very brief mention of suicidal ideation. Listener discretion is advised. Last month, we all became obsessed with Vicky White, the prison guard who busted out her boyfriend and went on the run one day before she was due to retire. The news, and especially social media, were basically a chorus of the modern-day ballad of Vicky and Casey. I know in our Facebook group, the posts were coming in back-to-back for a couple of days before we made a dedicated thread about Vicky White and Casey Cole White, better known as the Alabama jailbreak couple. But the air in our collective tires was let out a bit when it was reported that Vicky shot herself as U.S. Marshals were closing in on her arrest after they rammed the couple off the road in Evansville, Indiana. The couple had seemed to emulate Bonnie and Clyde, the most famous American outlaw couple. They shared a last name, but they had not married yet, though they had been romantic for some time. Investigators found that once they were caught and cornered, they had planned to die in a shootout with police. But Casey immediately surrendered, and Vicky, having now lost everything, took her own life. Unfortunately, we have many American examples of Bonnie and Clyde wannabes. Today's case is about another infamous lovebird jailbreak. The story of Jennifer and George Hyatt also ends tragically, though it was an innocent man who lost his life before they were captured. The Hyatts also fancied themselves a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde, in a more literal sense, with Jennifer later romanticizing their brief but violent moment in the spotlight. What makes a mother of three with a good job turn so quickly, choosing a violent man over her children, a man she was willing to kill for, die for? She gave up everything for just a few days with the so-called love of her life. Welcome to episode 155, Prison Break, the story of Jennifer and George Hyatt. Located 35 miles southwest of Knoxville, Tennessee, with a population of around 6,000, sits Kingston, the county seat of Roane County, Tennessee. In the early 1850s, Kingston was chosen as the new home for the Roane County Courthouse. The building was used for its intended purpose from 1856 until 1974, when everything was moved over to a new building on an adjacent site. The courthouse was then added to the National Register of Historic Places. It is currently a museum and is one of 6 remaining antebellum county courthouses in the state of Tennessee. The morning of August 9, 2005, was a typical one for prison officers Larry Harris and Cotton Morgan. They were in the courthouse, standing guard, while George Hyatt pled guilty to armed robbery. The only other person in attendance was the defendant's wife, Jennifer, a former prison nurse who had fallen for her husband while on the job. The Hyatts had been married for a few months and were desperate to be together on the outside. They would do anything to make their dream a reality. After George pled guilty, he nodded at Jennifer, and she quietly left the courtroom. Minutes later, Officer Morgan would be dead, and the Hyatts would be fugitives. Jennifer Forsythe was born on February 11, 1974, to parents Floyd and Sally, who later divorced. Jennifer was described by her mother as being a good kid who never got in trouble, but she had a gullibility for men. When told to do something, she just did it without thinking about the consequences. While attending high school in Utah, Jennifer met a man named Eli. In 1992, the same year she graduated, 18-year-old Jennifer married Eli. She was pregnant 3 months with his child. They would go on to have 2 other children. Jennifer and Eli's marriage only lasted 8 years. She later said it wasn't the greatest relationship. It was filled with fighting, drugs, and alcohol. After the couple divorced in 2000, Jennifer took custody of the 3 children and ended up remarrying. Then, immediately after tying the knot to her second husband, Jennifer started an affair with a man she had actually met at her wedding. When Jennifer's new husband found out, he left, and the boyfriend moved in. But that relationship didn't work either. It's possibly because Jennifer had an affair with that boyfriend's best friend. It seems like Jennifer's mother, Sally, knew her daughter well. Jennifer did have a gullibility for men. She tended to blindly follow whichever man was giving her the attention she needed. I told Haley as I was reading up on this case that it sounded like Jennifer had very low self-esteem, and I wondered what had happened in her early life to cause it. Later, her diary provided some insight. In mid-2001, Jennifer's friend Tina talked her into visiting Nashville. Jennifer fell in love with Tennessee during her trip, so she and her kids moved there. 3 years later, Jennifer became an LPN. She then took a job with a state contractor where she worked at Northwest Correctional Complex in Tiptonville, providing health care to inmates. It was at Northwest that 30-year-old Jennifer Forsyth met George Hyatt, a 33-year-old inmate the prosecution once described as a smooth-talking ladies' man. Born on June 30th, 1971, George had a very long rap sheet with convictions in multiple counties dating back to 1989 when he was 17 years old. But his troubles started much earlier than that. According to a New York Times article, at 9 years old, George was truant and his behavior was unruly. A volunteer chaplain later told the Chattanooga Times Free Press that George would snap. One minute he would be so calm, and then he'd explode in anger. The Roane Sheriff's Department spokesman described George as extremely violent, and he has no care or concern on what he does to anyone. By 17, George had already been through an alcohol and drug treatment program. After he dropped out of school, he went on to live a life of crime, racking up charges for theft, drug possession, forgery, aggravated robbery, before moving on to more violent crimes. George escaped from jail at least 2 times, and possibly up to 5. Records are a bit murky there. So we only know the details of 2 escapes. One of them was in December 1998. After one day, he was found, charged with the escape, and was sentenced to 36 months. In July 2002, after being released for the prison escape, George was arrested for robbery, then bailed out. A month later in August, he was arrested for aggravated robbery. This time, he was kept in custody. On November 23rd, that same year, George and another inmate escaped jail after threatening guards with a knife made from toothbrushes and a razor blade. One guard handed over a key to the inmates. Then they beat the other officer until he passed out. 2 outside men helped them get away, but within days, they were all arrested at a DUI checkpoint in Southwest Florida. George was charged with 2 counts of aggravated assault for assaulting the guards and was sentenced to 10 years. He was also sentenced to 15 years for the aggravated robbery from August 2002. That brings us to 2004, when Jennifer Forsyth took the job at Northwest Correctional Complex, where George was serving his sentence. Within 5 months of starting her new job, Jennifer was caught sneaking food to George. She was subsequently fired, and George was transferred to Riverbend in Nashville, where he and Jennifer managed to stay together. Using a smuggled cell phone, the couple managed to talk every day for hours. Their relationship became so serious that in the spring of 2005, Jennifer asked the prison warden's permission to marry George. He gave them his blessing, but only if they attended marriage counseling with a minister first. During their sessions, the minister gave Jennifer a detailed account of George's criminal history. She was surprised to find out she did not know everything George had done in his past. Struggling to process the true details of her fiancé's crimes, Jennifer postponed the wedding, which was supposed to be held on April 16, 2005. The minister thought Jennifer was a woman in denial. He was right. But George and Jennifer did marry a month later at Riverbend on May 20th, 2005. However, due to George's violent criminal history, not to mention his prior successful escapes, he was a close custody inmate and was not allowed visitors. This meant that George and Jennifer had to have a non-contact wedding. They couldn't kiss at the end or have any physical contact. Getting married did not change George's visitation rights either. Jennifer still would not be allowed to visit him, just telephone calls and letters. None of that mattered. Jennifer was in love with George and would go through anything to be with him. At some point following the wedding, George was transferred to Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Petros, Tennessee. It's unclear when or why this actually happened. If the prison sounds familiar, it's because it was where they said they were moving Hannibal Lecter in the movie Silence of the Lambs. Built in 1896 in the shape of a cross, Brushy Mountain was Tennessee's first maximum security prison, housing the dregs of society, the most violent offenders, rapists, and murderers, including James Earl Ray, who shot and killed Martin Luther King Jr. In 2008, the prisoners were moved to the Morgan County Correctional Complex in Wartburg, Tennessee, and Brushy Mountain opened for tours. It has a moonshine distillery, gift shop, and restaurant. As you pull in, there's a sign that reads, "Violent since 1896. The website tagline is, "Welcome to the end of the line." There are paranormal tours and concerts. Dwight Yoakam is performing there on the 25th this month, and the website says overnight camping is available. I've never been, but it does sound like quite the tourist attraction. Anyway, in early July, less than 2 months after her wedding, Jennifer tried to take her own life after she and George got into an argument. Jennifer later testified that she couldn't take being without him anymore. It was too hard, and she told George that. She said, "He started saying everything would be okay if he could get out and be with me." That's when the newlyweds started planning how they would get George out. But it would not be an easy task. George wasn't allowed visitors, and because of his history, prison staff would surely be keeping a close eye on him for any escape attempts. They thought long and hard about their options, then realized George had a hearing in August 2005 for the July 2002 robbery charge. He was supposed to plead guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence. It was the perfect time for him to escape. The couple decided that if they wanted to get away with their plan, they needed an extra car, a gun, and cash. Jennifer took care of everything. She planned to steal a car on a date close to the hearing. She withdrew cash, and she purchased a 9mm gun at a pawn shop. Jennifer even went a mile further and asked her dad, Floyd, if he had any spare handcuff keys. But Floyd had a bad feeling his daughter was going to help George escape by passing him a key. So he asked a probation officer in Utah to notify Tennessee authorities. According to the Utah Department of Corrections spokesman, at the time, the tip, quote, didn't appear to raise any flags, so Tennessee was not warned. This would be a fatal mistake. Floyd later told the Associated Press, quote, "There was no doubt in my mind that she was going to do something. I just didn't know it would be this." Jennifer decided the key wasn't necessary, and by mid-July, the Hyatt's plan was complete. All they had to do now was wait for August 9th to arrive. In the meantime, Jennifer worked as a home health care nurse while her kids stayed with their dad, Eli, in Utah. At this time, Jennifer told Eli that she was excited because George was going to be released from prison soon. On August 9th, 2005, George was transported from Brushy Mountain to the Roane County Courthouse in Kingston, Tennessee, for his hearing in regards to the July 2002 robbery. He was escorted by prison officers Larry White and Wayne Cotton Morgan. Born on October 31st, 1948, Wayne Thomas Morgan grew up in a close-knit family on a Tennessee farm with his parents, Porgia and Guy, and 11 siblings. Wayne was known to everyone as Cotton. He got his nickname because he was born with a head of white hair that didn't turn brown until after an army stint in Vietnam. In February 1969, after graduating from Central High School, Cotton did enlist in the Army where he served as an infantryman. 5 months later, Cotton married a woman named Vian. They loved singing together and would later welcome a son and daughter, Carla and Dennis. Cotton was then sent to Vietnam, where he earned a Purple Heart. Following his discharge from the Army in 1971, Cotton would go on to become a corrections officer at Brushy Mountain. He stayed there for 27 years before he switched to being a transport officer, but still working for Brushy in 2004. A volunteer chaplain at Brushy Mountain later told the Chattanooga Times Free Press that the inmates really liked Cotton. The chaplain said, quote, "Sometimes there's a wall between officers and inmates. It's us versus them. But it wasn't that way with Cotton. Inmates respected and loved him." In fact, after the Hyatts carried out their plan, prison officials were worried that if George was taken back to Brushy Mountain to continue his sentence, he would be killed by inmates who had loved Cotton. But Cotton was so much more than a corrections officer. He was a father, a husband. He was a Sunday school teacher, a choir singer, and a church deacon. He went to the nursing home, the county jail, anywhere to minister to anyone who needed it. Cotton's youngest sister said her brother would want everyone to know he is a Christian. A co-worker told the Tennessean that Cotton, quote, "had an impact on everybody he came in contact with. He was just a good man all the way around." Cotton was one of those guys who stood out, and you'll always remember. Cotton's son, Dennis, later told the Associated Press, quote, "My dad's time on earth was served as well as he could want it, and I think he did a good job at it." On August 9th, 56-year-old Cotton went to work at Brushy like he had for the past 28 years. He was looking forward to a trip coming up at the end of August. He and one of his brothers were supposed to go on vacation to gather honey. When it came time for George Hyatt to head over to the courthouse for his morning hearing, Cotton and his partner, Officer Harris, escorted him to the transport vehicle. He was handcuffed, shackled at the feet, and was wearing a waist chain. George was driven over to the Roane County Courthouse. According to the Journal-Gazette, the courtroom was nearly empty. One of the only people in there was Jennifer, who sat in the front row. According to Officer Harris, after George pled guilty to armed robbery, he looked out the window and started tearing up and seemed broken up about it. Always one to help out a fellow human, Cotton started talking to George, comforting him. George was then sentenced to 6 years. This was in addition to the 25 years he was already serving for aggravated robbery and aggravated assault. As George rose to face the judge, he looked at Jennifer and nodded. Jennifer then got up and left. Just after 10 a.m., Cotton and Harris walked George back to the van and tried to put him in, but he started to squirm and try to break free. Jennifer pulled up behind the van in a Ford Explorer SUV, stopped it, and got out. George yelled to Jennifer to shoot Cotton. Both officers then whipped around to see who he was yelling at. That's when they saw Jennifer. She was standing near the rear of the van in a shooting stance, pointing a gun at them. Cotton turned towards Jennifer, put his hands up, and let out a no right before Jennifer shot him in the stomach. Then Jennifer turned her gun on Harris, and they started exchanging gunfire. Jennifer and George ran to Jennifer's SUV while Harris emptied his 6-shot revolver in their direction. He then grabbed Cotton's gun and kept firing as Jennifer hopped in the driver's seat with George in the passenger seat. They sped off, ready to ride off into the horizon and their new life together. When the smoke cleared, Harris realized a bullet had grazed his right arm and a ricocheted bullet hit his stomach. He rushed over to his partner to see how he was doing. It was bad. Hoping to keep him focused and alert, Harris tried to keep Cotton talking as they waited for the paramedics. Officer Cotton Morgan was airlifted to the University of Tennessee Medical Center. He was pronounced dead within an hour. Both Cotton and Harris had bulletproof vests, but they were bulky and ill-fitting, so they weren't wearing them that day. A month before the shooting, Brushy Mountain had put in an order to have officers fitted for vests, but they hadn't gotten around to it yet. Helicopters were immediately deployed to look for the Hyatts. Medical facilities were asked to notify police if George or Jennifer came in to receive treatment for a gunshot wound. Authorities also asked the public for any tips, but warned them not to approach the Hyatts as they were considered armed and dangerous. After they had left the courthouse parking lot, Jennifer and George ditched her SUV at a sandwich shop about a half a mile away. The night before, Jennifer had stolen a van from a home health care client and parked it at the sandwich shop. The couple got into the van Jennifer had stolen and drove to Erlanger, Kentucky, which is basically the corner where the Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky borders all meet up. It was around 275 miles or 4 hours from Kingston, Tennessee. While near Erlanger, Jennifer bought a hacksaw and rented a motel room at Econo Lodge. She cut George out of his handcuffs and then cut her light brown hair, which she then dyed black. The Hyatts threw away the murder weapon and George's inmate jumpsuit in the dumpster and spent the night at the motel. In the morning, Jennifer and George hired a taxi for the next leg of their journey. They gave the driver, Mike, two $100 bills up front to take them to an America's Best Value Inn in Columbus, Ohio, a 2-hour drive, around 115 miles from Erlanger. Mike noticed Jennifer was favoring one leg, so he asked her what was going on. She said she had been in a car accident. That was obviously a lie, but she had been shot in the upper thigh by Officer Harris when they exchanged gunfire. During the drive, the couple told Mike Wagers that they needed to get to Columbus to attend an Amway convention. Mike later said he did not believe them because they didn't act like Amway representatives. He told NBC, quote, "Amway people are all about Amway, and when they didn't try any further conversation about it, that's when I pretty much thought, well, they're not with Amway, they're doing something else." Jennifer and George checked into America's Best Value Inn at around lunchtime. They booked 3 nights and paid cash. Once they were settled in their room, the couple ordered Mexican food and watched television. Later that night, the cab driver, Mike, was at home relaxing and playing video games when a friend called to tell him that a fugitive couple's stolen van was found abandoned in Erlanger. The friend mentioned that it was reported that a taxi had picked up the couple after they ditched the van. Mike instantly thought he might be the taxi driver they were talking about, so he contacted the police. On August 10th, around 36 hours after the shooting, more than 25 officers surrounded the motel room. Deputy U.S. Marshal Nikki Ralston called the couple's room phone, and Jennifer answered. Deputy Ralston said, "Hey, Jennifer," and when Jennifer replied yes, Ralston knew she had the right person. She then told Jennifer, "You need to get George. Both of you need to exit the hotel room and follow the direction of the officers who will be on your immediate right." As Jennifer exited the room, she was limping, and she begged officers not to hurt George. She then told George, baby, it'll be okay, it'll be okay." He exited the room with his shirt pulled over his head, then walked backwards toward the stairwell, where he got on his knees and was handcuffed. He definitely knew the drill. In the motel room, officers found Mountain Dew and Hawaiian Punch cans on the nightstand, empty bags of takeout on a desk, one mattress pushed halfway off the box spring, and weapons. George was booked in the Franklin County Jail, while Jennifer was taken to the hospital to get treatment for the gunshot wound. Once she was patched up, she was also booked. Both Jennifer and George were originally charged with unlawful flight, federal charges, but those were quickly dropped so the couple could be extradited back to Tennessee to face state charges of murder. On August 12th, Jennifer fought extradition back to Tennessee, most likely because the judge told her she could face the death penalty in Tennessee. The Associated Press reported that Jennifer looked dazed at her hearing. After Jennifer's hearing, George had his. He was going to waive his right to fight extradition, but then his attorney informed him that Jennifer had fought extradition. George then told the judge, "I don't want to leave without her." "I don't want to," he insisted. While Jennifer was still in Ohio, authorities confiscated letters and a 34-page diary titled A Modern-Day Bonnie and Clyde from her cell. According to the Knoxville News Sentinel, the diary starts with Jennifer growing up in Utah and ends with her arriving in Tennessee in 2001. In the diary, Jennifer says her first memory was of her parents' divorce in Utah. She and her sister split their time between their mom and their dad. When their father remarried, Jennifer and her sister were not invited. 4 years later, one of Jennifer's stepmother's family members molested her and her sister, but they never told anyone. Jennifer wrote that at 15 she started using drugs and alcohol. As an adult, she would become so addicted to drugs that she would be sold off for drugs if she and her husband Eli didn't have enough money. If even part of her story is true, it explains a lot about Jennifer's low self-esteem and her bad choices as she became an adult and mother. She had been abandoned, then used and abused, leading to addiction problems. To be crystal clear for my holier-than-thou reviewers, because I know y'all still listen, this is an explanation, not an excuse. It is really sad to me that now, in 2022, I still cannot point out things in a killer's early life that might point to their later violence. I thought true crime was about understanding motives. The why is more important than the how to me. But some people come for the gory details, not nuanced storytelling. Sorry for my rant, but I don't appreciate being mischaracterized. I never excuse murder, but if I can somehow explain how someone becomes a killer, I think that is a compelling part of a story. And it's also the damn truth. Anyway, back to this murder. In her letters written in jail, Jennifer Hyatt wrote about helping George escape and shooting the guards, and about how she took antibiotics and pain meds for the bullet wound she suffered in the shooting. Jennifer wrote that for the first time, she had taken control of her own destiny. She also said that the 36 hours she spent with George were the best of her life. She and George were more than soulmates. They had a celestial love, and they were two halves of the same soul. Jennifer wrote in her letters about how she thought about George while waiting for extradition. She had written to George saying, "I love you so damn much, and still nobody can understand why." Officer Cotton Morgan's funeral was held on August 12th at the Wartburg Central Middle School gym. Around 1,000 people attended his funeral, including Tennessee Governor Phil Bredesen. The governor spoke for around 5 minutes and presented the Morgan family with a Tennessee Medal of Valor. Officer Morgan was buried with full military honors, a 21-gun salute, taps, and a flyby from 4 helicopters. On August 23rd, George and Jennifer were extradited back to Tennessee. When they went to their first court hearing, more than 40 officers surrounded the county jail as U.S. Marshals delivered the couple. Some officers were wearing bulletproof vests, and some had shotguns. The road beside the courthouse was closed, and the courthouse was closed to the public. Both Hyatts pled not guilty. On September 17, 2007, Jennifer avoided the death penalty by pleading to first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and facilitating an escape. She was sentenced to life without parole for murder, 15 years for attempted murder, and 3 years for facilitating an escape. As part of the plea deal, Jennifer was going to have to testify against George at his trial. That would have been interesting, to see if she held up her end of the plea deal. But she didn't have to. On March 9, 2009, George pled guilty to first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and felony escape. He was sentenced to life without parole for the first-degree murder, 15 years for attempted first-degree murder, and 3 years for felony escape. It doesn't look like either George or Jennifer have appealed their sentences, which was most likely part of their plea deals. Today, George Hyatt is incarcerated in the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. Pending any successful appeals, he will die in prison. Jennifer Hyatt is incarcerated in the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville. In November 2014, Jennifer created a profile on a prison pen pal website where she listed herself as divorced, so it doesn't appear that she is still in contact with the other half of her soul. Pending any successful appeals, she will also die in prison. In 2009, Brushy Mountain Prison was relocated to the new Morgan County Correctional Complex, around 10 miles away. There's a plaque there honoring Cotton, and the road where the Morgan County Correctional Complex was built off of was renamed Wayne Cotton Morgan Drive. Jennifer may have thought she was part of a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde, but her man was no Clyde Barrow, thank God. It didn't take tea leaves for the violent, institutionalized George Hyatt to see how this would end. He still wanted to live, even if he died in prison. He had been there most of his life and evidently didn't mind going back. Jennifer may have wanted to die in a hail of bullets if she and George were caught. She certainly tried and was lucky to have only been grazed by Officer Larry Harris. Now, she will probably die in prison, but she no longer has George's love to sustain her. If she had gone out that way, I certainly don't believe she would have been mourned or celebrated like her idols, Bonnie and Clyde. As Bonnie Parker herself predicted in poetry, to a few it'll be grief, to the law a relief, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde. It's just going to be a long, slow death for Jennifer and George. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelly. Today's episode was written and researched by myself and Haley Gray. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. If you have any case suggestions, please visit my website, southernfriedtruecrime.com, and go to the Listener Suggestion tab. And if you have submitted a case suggestion in the last few months, please resubmit it on the website. This is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages. With 3 platforms to manage, it is very overwhelming for me. I hope you understand. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. I much prefer spending my social media time in our lovely group. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds. But it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit ass is allowed. It is not a motto, it is how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, please don't forget to subscribe and tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on all large platforms like iHeart, Stitcher, and Spotify. As you learned from my whining in this episode, after a recent and evidently controversial episode, I could use some good reviews from true listeners who understand nuance and context. If you've never reviewed Southern Fried, I really would appreciate it now. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.